Thanks, guys. So first, I have to take my friend who's being stuck with the computer and get my friend who knows things about computers to go help him. Because, oh, it's back? All right. So hit the slideshow again.
What?
Hit the slideshow thing again. In the middle, yep.
That's what made it last time. See?
That's why I was sending Jeff over there. That's perfect. Oh no, just bring that one back up.
It's the plus symbol.
Yeah, perfect. As long as you guys can all see those pictures. Yeah. Sorry, I figured we'd get this out of the way first, and then what'd you do? So now hit that. Boop.
That's gonna make it get out again.
Oh.
Yeah, that was the one.
I don't know. We could look at it like this too. You have any secrets? No. All right. Cool. So anyway, I work, as he said, with the Rumney Climbers Association, and we try to do things to advocate for keeping climbing open and also really caring for the land up there. And so he reached out to the Rumney Climbers Association to see if anybody wanted to do a presentation, and I have a bunch of photographs, and I've been climbing out there for a long time, so I figured I would step up. I mean, as you can see, it's an absolutely beautiful place. This is one of the best views I've ever seen from standing on the ground out in the hills of New Hampshire. I can't think of another spot where it's just as picturesque, and the climbing out there is absolutely amazing. So that's actually a picture of me last fall climbing in the evening as we were waiting for the moon to rise for a photo shoot with the moon, and it was a beautiful shot. I think I threw it into the show there. Anyway, little quick intro to who I am and where I came from here. So I started climbing with my father many years ago. Click a little slide there. Boom. So this is my dad, Ernie Hanchy, and I started climbing with him at a place called Rumney down in Manchester, New Hampshire. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that, but it's about a 100-foot tall cliff. It's a beautiful piece of rock, but it has the unfortunate fate of being kind of in a neighborhood. And there's a lot of neighborhood kids that go up there and throw bottles off the top and things like that. And it's really just kind of misused. But it's a great place for young aspiring climbers to go get into some trouble. And that's exactly what me and my dad did, because my dad was never really that good of an influence when it came to adventure. I can't even tell you how many times I almost died with him. But he made me a good adventurer, because like standing up to that, to those sketchy situations is what helps you survive. So anyway, the way we started was we were scrambling around, just no ropes or anything, just sort of experimenting on the rocks down in Rumney. And there was a moment where we got up, probably about 25, 30 feet up, about the height where all of a sudden you're like, yeah, we don't want to fall from here. This is bad news. And I looked at him and he looked at me. And we kind of took a second and looked again. And he goes, I'm stuck, how about you? And I was just like, uh-huh. So we kind of just stared at each other for a little while and then quietly sat there, and like, any move could mean a 30-foot fall and a trip to the hospital at least. And so him being, having the mental state of a teenager, he was probably about 40 at that time. He just looked at me and he said, okay, at count of 3, let's start climbing down. I said, okay. So 3, 2, 1, and we just like went for it. And we got down to the bottom and we looked at each other like, okay, that was scary. And then like a week later, he took a lesson on how to operate the ropes and all the other equipment, and basically learned how to not hurt ourselves next time. Adventures like that, continued, but of course, we got a little bit safer and a little bit safer as time went on. So this is actually out in Yosemite National Park on a feature called Half Dome that a lot of people are aware of. And it's a route called the Snake Dike. And it's about 1,000 feet of technical climbing and then like another 2,000 feet of less technical climbing. And so on that trip, he decided that he had done the right thing with me when he was younger in introducing me to climbing, because now I could drag him up everything he wanted to do and we wouldn't get hurt. So yeah, now I'm... you can flip another slide there. So this is another one of my dad. This one's up at Rumney, so that's a little bit more local. And you can see the snow in the background. We usually don't really care what the weather's like. We just go out anyway. But this is Who's a climber out here? Who do we have for climbers in the audience? Cool. So we got a nice split between climbers and just sort of, interested locals and history buffs. That's cool. Anyway, this is up on Yellowknife Buttress, which is one of the cliffs up in Rumney. I can move forward. And that's, so we ended up going on travels all over the country. This is out in Bishop, California. That's my old man standing on top of a boulder. Click. You can kind of scroll through until you get to stuff. So this is another crazy adventure that me and my dad went on. So years before this picture was taken, this is up on Mount Monadnock. If any of you guys have hiked up there, you know there's a bunch of cliffs up there. So when I was very young, I watched my dad go up that thing and he said, no, you shouldn't do this. But he was going to, and he went up. It's probably about a 20-foot tall crack, maybe 25 feet. And it's what climbers call an off-width crack. So off-widths are wide. They're too wide to like jam, your hands in, but too narrow to like climb into. And so it's an awkward size. And he ended up taking a 20-foot fall onto a rock and spraining his ankle very badly. And he had 2 young kids up there. And I said, oh my goodness, are you okay? And he went, I'm fine, let's hike down. And I was like, okay. So like we got back to the car and then he pulled his pant leg up and his ankle was like this. But so years later, of course, being a good son, I was hiking by that crack. I said, remember that crack? And he was just like, yes. And I was like, let's climb it. So I dragged him up it and he ended up doing it and didn't hurt himself. So that was good. Click. Cool. So that's me sitting on top of the overhanging summit of Half Dome out in Yosemite. Basically, it's probably about, if you slipped from there, it would be about 2,500 feet straight down, and then it's another steep hill beyond that. And so it's quite an exposed spot, and it was a place that I had seen in magazines, and it had been like this bucket list, life goal to go out and sit on that spot. So I went out and did that. All right, so back to Bishop here. So basically, as we get into the history of Rumney, there's a bunch of different types of climbing. So this here is called bouldering. So you can see there's a pad right underneath me. And we drag those pads around, put them underneath things, and if we fall down, we land on those, typically safely. And then we've got all the gear stuff and widgets, which I'll kind of go over as well. Click. All right, that's another picture of bouldering. That one's not mine. That's a gentleman named Tim Kemple took that photo. He's a pretty well-known climbing photographer. Click. All right, back out at Rumney. So basically what I ended up doing with climbing was, when I started with my dad, there were a number of years where we didn't really progress very much. We kind of were out on our own. Like you heard how we started just being nuts. And so once we learned how to use ropes and stuff, we got out and we were able to stay safe, but we still didn't know how to progress in climbing. And there's a lot of little tricks to climbing, and if you don't have a mentor, it can be a little bit limiting. So we went probably 7 or 8 years, just me, my dad, and my brother going out and poking around the cliffs, and we were getting kind of stagnant with it, and we didn't really know what to do with it. But then, I don't know if any of you guys have, any of you non-climbers know about the indoor rock climbing scene, but around, I think it was 1998, an indoor climbing gym opened down in Manchester called Vertical Dreams. And basically I went there on opening day and dragged my dad in, and we met this community of climbers, which really changed everything. And that's one of the special things about rock climbing is the community and basically the friends that you make. And picture the friends that you have, those of you who are non-rock climbers, picture the friends that you have and the things that you do together, right? So you do these things that are meaningful to you. You go out, you go for a walk, you go out and maybe go canoeing or something, and you guys work together to do something. Well, picture if typically in an average day, you had to save each other's lives, right? That grows a bond that's like really intense. And so in climbing, we literally save each other's lives all day, every day. When somebody falls, your friend is on the other side of that rope, right? So it takes those, just fun like days out and turns it into something where you guys are very much depending on each other in a very real way. So when I learned more about the climbing community, I just completely, dove into it and became a part of it. And since then, I've become more and more a part of, climbing's become more of a part of me since. And so now I've been running Vertical Dreams as a manager for 17 years, this will be. We opened up a second location and we've brought, the community out a little bit. I also started teaching people outside because of the way that I got into climbing. I thought that it was really important to share the safer, practices with people. So I started doing that. Here, click again. Boom. So I take it very seriously, as you can see. That's me out around Christmas time dressed as Buddy the Elf, if anybody's familiar with that movie. Click. But basically, over the years, I've gotten more and more involved with it. I've been teaching for a number of years now. I coach some of my, well, at least one of my climbing students is here. And, I guide out in the hills, and I'm part of the Rumney Climbers Association. I'm involved with guidebook information and all kinds of things, and photography. And so now, if you basically took climbing out of my life, I think I'd probably just disappear. I don't think there's anything that's not connected to it at this point. Click. All right. I'm just gonna click through a few here, just give people enough time to have a peek. So these pictures are by a friend of mine named Brent Dosher, obviously where I'm in the picture. There's the one with the moon, yeah. So this guy, Brent Dosher, is an amazing photographer. He shoots all kinds of different things, but climbing is one of his passions. This picture was particularly cool because it was like the miracle of technology mixed with an artist who has a vision, right? So he was up sitting at that spot. Remember the spot at the beginning where I said, this is the best view you can take from the ground in New Hampshire. He was sitting there and he had this app on his phone where he could see where the moon was going to be on any given day at any given time. And so he scrolled through to figure out when the moon was going to be in just the right spot for that picture. And so he called me 3 months before this was taken. And he said, where are you going to be on August 24th at 7:30 p.m.? And I was like, wherever your camera's going to be. And he said, how would you like to climb Predator? So the name of this route, we name all the climbs. So the name of this route is Predator. And I said, yeah, let's do it. So that picture you saw at the very beginning, that was a little bit wider, was me kind of playing around on the cliff. We didn't think the moon was going to come up behind the clouds. It was a misty evening. And so he was getting that shot, and then I was hanging on the rope for a minute. I looked over, and I went, the moon, it's out, let's do this. So he got this shot, and I thought that was a really cool shot. It really captures the mood of the evening out there. Cool, we can click forward. So, enough about me. We'll talk a little bit about the climbing history, just sort of a brief history of climbing in New Hampshire. And pardon me, I don't have it all completely memorized, so there we go. So I always have to give a little bit of credit to undocumented climbs. And the first ones that come to mind are things that Native Americans may have climbed around on. This place had a lot of Native people, and I'm sure that they're all over these hills and could possibly have been up some of the climbs that we then later came on and said that, this was our climb. So basically, the first documented climb using a rope was at Joe English Hill down in New Boston. And that was back, I want to say in around 1919 or something like that. Some folks went out to Europe and learned some techniques they were using out in Europe, brought some equipment back and started, southern New Hampshire, they're like, oh, here's a cliff, let's do it. And they played around on that. But there are various small cliffs down in southern New Hampshire that see a lot of climbing. Click forward here. Boom. So these ones are in Pawtuckaway, and that's actually my slideshow operator right up there. And that's me belaying. My wife took that picture. I actually didn't even mean to tell this story, but you know how I get with stories. So this is actually right before a really exciting fall that he took. So any of you guys who know this, this is the lower slabs at Pawtuckaway. And what he's doing there is he's doing what we call lead climbing. So he's climbing up, he has a rope attached to him, and he's using some of these pieces of gear to wedge into the cracks that go along there. You clip your rope into it, and then the gear catches you using the rope. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, he hadn't put any gear in yet, and he went up another 5 feet above that, and the feet are really slippery. And so, you know, I was talking about people saving each other's lives every day out there. Basically, he got up there and he just slipped, by surprise, and I didn't have anything I could do with the rope because it wasn't attached to anything yet. So I just put my hands up, and I don't know how else to say it. I just caught him by his butt. So he came right down on me. I caught him by the butt, and I'm standing on rocks, and I ran backwards like this and took a few steps and set him down gently at the base of the climb. And I was just like, so that's how that works. It was pretty exciting. But he got back on and he did it, so click. Yeah, after that tangent, I don't even know where I'm going here. Oh, so yeah, this is a little bit more Pawtuckaway. Click. There we go. That's Rock Rimmon. That's that area down in Manchester that I said we got started on. This is a young lady friend of mine named Lily. She was out doing a little bit of free solo climbing, so she doesn't have a rope on. Basically, there's a small number of climbers, or I should say a small number of ascents are done without ropes. It's been getting a lot of publicity lately because there's a documentary out called Free Solo, which basically is about a guy climbing the biggest, hardest cliff in America without a rope. But anyway, I think a lot of people that don't climb, look at climbers as, being kind of nutters out there taking big risks. And what we typically do if we're not using proper protection is we operate well below our maximum level. And so, she was climbing things that, where she was hanging on just by her fingertips. So this one's not too bad. But you can see the neighborhood, so you can imagine that like the neighborhood kids come out and they want to play around up there. The problem with neighborhood kids coming out and throwing bottles off is they don't stay kids forever. And then they still go up there and party, and then they have kids and their kids go up there and party. So now it's just kind of a mess. Click. Thank you, sir. You can click through a couple. More Pawtuckaway stuff. All right, so this is where I wanted to go. So the first big climb up in the north country was called the Whitney-Gilman Ridge, and it's on Cannon Cliff. So when you drive through Franconia Notch, this is one of the notable features that goes up it. And it's a ridge climb. It's about 600 feet from that bottom to right up on top there. And it's a magical spot, but it's definitely a dangerous place to climb. There's a lot of loose rock, and finding your way on the cliffs is very difficult. There's a lot of twisting and turning. And so click forward a little more. Cool, so this is the approach, hiking up to it. You can see all the talus down here, all these broken rocks. There's rocks the size of cars and rocks, the size of, I don't know, what you call it, chihuahuas? I don't know. Anyway, little ones. And so when you're hiking up, you can kind of see the evidence of the cliff just basically falling down over the years. And this type of cliff is called an exfoliation dome, which basically is saying, yeah, it's falling off. It's just, every year more stuff falls off. So you got to be really cautious about, the conditions and how you're climbing on the rock. Click. So, good. So this is what the climbing looks like up there. You can click through a few here, just kind of have people have a look. Boom. So it gets actually pretty steep for a climb that is considered fairly easy. Click again. And so this is the view from getting up toward the top of it. But let me just tell you a little bit about the way that they climbed this back in 1929 is when they first did this. They were climbing with a length of hemp rope, which didn't have any stretch to it. It's very abrasive. And they basically tied the rope around their waist. And the other person, I don't know how far this mic will go here. The other person would have the other end of the rope, basically just behind their back like this. Like, I got you, right? And that was the first style of what we call belaying, which is basically just the art of holding up a climber while they fall. But the old rule of climbing was the leader does not fall. So the person who's putting the rope up, the person who's in front does not fall. It was actually written in books, the AMCA handbook to climbing. It didn't say should not fall, it said does not fall. That's his job. So this climb was done in what we call 17 pitches originally. And a pitch is basically just a place where the person who's in the lead stops and the follower, the second person, comes up to them. These days, that route can be done in 3 long pitches, 200-foot stretches. But what they were doing was they were just going up to the next decent stance and then helping the other person up. And so they didn't have all these fancy gadgets and things that we have now. They were basically probably driving in some very old pitons, or that you'd nail into the rock, but they also would, for the most part, be tying slings off to things or draping a rope around a loose piece of rock so that if they fell, maybe that would hold them. They had to be very creative, and also it was probably less safe than free soloing. Not really, but all right, click again. Anyway, so yeah, they did it in that style, but picture with those old tactics, being up in a spot like this, 600 feet directly off the ground, and just taking your life in your hands there. This is my buddy Devin. I don't know where he is. He lives right down the street. Some friend. Anyway, I kind of want to get a little video of us all laughing at Devin. Anyway, click on that. And that's another climb up there. I believe that's on Moby Grape, which is another cool climb. Click. Cool. So just make sure I got what I wanted on that. Yeah. So North Conway is one of the other big areas for climbing around here. And if any of you guys have ever been up to North Conway, the cliffs up there are a notable feature. So you have Cathedral Ledge and Whitehorse Ledge and Humphreys Ledge. Those are the 3 big ones. Now Humphreys is kind of off to the side, and that's actually where I took this photo from. So I was up high up on Humphreys, and I shot looking south, and this is the hill that is Cathedral, and this is the hill in the background, which is Whitehorse. So Cathedral at its tallest is probably about 500 feet, and Whitehorse is maybe 700 or 800 feet, but a lot of the cliffs lean forward. They're like what we call slabs. So the length of the roots is actually longer than the height of the cliff. And so, click. So this is the thin air face on Cathedral Ledge. And some of you guys who know climbing and might know where the route goes can tell that that is a climber right there. So that one is about a 400-foot climb. And I pull this up because the first climb done on Cathedral Ledge was the standard route, and that actually goes up just sort of along this corner. There's what we call a chimney where you can kind of wedge your body in there. And that was the first climb done on Cathedral Ledge, at least all the way to the top. Click. Just some more cathedral pictures here. Got to have some fun. This is my buddy Hale. He's another guy who I trained when he was younger. I think I trained him from the time he was like 14 to the time he was 18. He went on to a life in climbing where he was working for one of the big advocacy organizations, the Access Fund. He was their membership director, and the Access Fund is actually who the RCA works closely with to acquire our land and make sure that we keep it safe. So. It's always good to be able to introduce somebody to that kind of thing and then watch them just, kind of become a big part of it and have it become a big part of them. This is a route called the Prow. Click on that. Click. And a friend of mine named John Baldessari, or we call him Baldy, even though he has a thick head of hair. Anyway, this is a historic climb as well, but again, we want to kind of get into some Rumney, so we're going to click on here. And that's finishing it up. Any of you guys who have done the routes in that area know that little pine tree right up at the top. That's the finish of the climb. It's about a 500-foot route. Click. Cool. So this is Whitehorse Ledge. And Whitehorse Ledge is the one on the left. Basically, if you're looking from town, the cathedral's over there, Whitehorse is on the left. And this is the slabs. And you can see just this really cool sea of rock right there. And that sea of rock is this big forward-leaning cliff. And it's just kind of otherworldly to be up there. Click. So back in 1932, the standard route on Whitehorse was done, and that was the first time anybody ever went through and climbed that one from bottom to top. Click. You can see it's basically just the friction of your feet. Here, go back one there, Jeremy. That's it. No, it's okay. I actually told you to forward it, but you can see there's no holds. Basically, it's just sticking your feet to the rock. And a lot of people find that a little disconcerting because you don't actually have something to grip onto, and especially where we teach people on easier routes that have, you know, grips on them. Once we transition to that kind of stuff, it's like, what? And you're just like, yeah, just trust the, you know, trust the friction. It works great. Click. Yep, more Whitehorse. That's my dad. This on, what is it? Last Unicorn, for any of you guys who know the climbs around here. Click. That's one more from Cathedral Ledge. My friend Tori took that picture. That's me on the Peanut Gallery Flake, which is a really neat crack. So a lot of the old routes followed really what we call weaknesses in the cliff. And so if you look at a cliff and it all looks steep and sheer, and then there's this one section that looks kind of broken apart, or it looks like it's less steep or something like that, that's considered the weakness in the climb. And so that is the easiest place to get up. And so the way things used to be done is, you know, someone would walk up to a cliff and they would look at, say, the Whitney Gilman Ridge and be like, that looks like a thing I can follow, and it looks like there could be holds, so I'm gonna go there. And once the cliff was climbed, like, they were like, okay, that cliff's been done, let's go do something else. And then they would climb the other cliff. So over the years, different weaknesses have been followed. And so any crack in the cliff could be considered a good passage to the top of the climb. Click forward here. Cool, so that brings us to a little bit of a gear lesson for you guys. And I apologize for anybody who's an avid climber, if any of this is a review for you. But basically, there are different styles of climbing. I had said there's bouldering, right? That's the one where you have the mat underneath you and you just kind of throw that down. That was sort of a later development. And then this is what we call trad climbing, or it's short for traditional climbing. Traditional climbing, we're typically following cracks, and we place this gear in the cracks as we go. And so there's various types of gear. Now the way it started was with, like I said, pitons. Now pitons are basically hammered into the wall. So you'd take one of these guys off, you'd wedge it into a crack, you'd take a hammer, bang it in there, and then you'd clip a carabiner to it. Back in the day, they would just clip a couple carabiners, but now we use these slings. The slings can be extended for convenience, so you can clip onto that. And then you would clip your rope into that. So you'd take this guy right here. That would be attached to your harness. We clip this into that carabiner. And then as you climb up, if you fall, this carabiner and your belayer on the other side help to catch you. So that's the general idea with trad climbing, is you're placing gear into cracks. Now the problem with the old school trad climbing with the pitons is that it damages the rock. And so people who rock climb, this is going to sound very obvious, but we love rock. And so we didn't want to be damaging the rock and then leaving it, you know, worse for the next person. And so some pioneers came up with some gear that you could use, and you could remove it, what we call cleanly, without damaging the rock. And so these, I guess the bigger ones are easier to see. These are called nuts. All right, and so basically the way nuts started was, you know, they would put pieces of rope, pieces of sling, like this, into like an actual piece of metal, like a nut that you'd use to, you know, screw something in, and you'd wedge that into the rock. Now, very quickly, they started designing them specifically for climbing, and they have looked like this for a long time. So as you're climbing, you can take one of these things, wedge it into a crack, and then the person who cleans it out uses what we call a nut tool. And so you take your little tool off your harness and you bang it a couple times, and you can get that out. And basically, that's another way to protect without damaging the rock. So the problem with the nuts is that if you have a crack that's parallel or wide, there's nothing you can use that for. And so they're still using pitons for certain types of placements, and that was continuing to damage the rock. So then some more ingenious people, some engineers, because almost every climber in the world is an engineer, Seriously, when I meet a climber, I just kind of, oh, hello, what kind of engineer are you? All right? Anyway. Anyway, so these were invented. These are called cams, or they were originally called friends. And basically, what they do is, oh, cool. You can see one right there. Anyway, what they do is they're spring-loaded devices where you pull the trigger, you insert it into the crack, and when it expands, it hits the sides of the walls. And when you actually weight it, because of the mechanics of it, it's ingenious. Anyway, the harder you pull down on it, the tighter it gets into the crack, because it's the physics of it it's tightening up on itself. And so these things are fantastic, and they work on completely parallel cracks. As you can see, you can make them quite big. So that's pretty cool. And then you can also make them incredibly small and still have them effective. Like this right here is another one of them, but it's tiny. It's a little bit easier to learn how to place these because you can see more of the details. But anyway, so that's trad climbing. You can see I taped my hands up because when you're climbing cracks, you kind of abrade your hands a lot. You can see some blood coming through there. I think that's why they took the picture. It wasn't because of the cool pants I'm wearing. Click. Awesome. So you can see he's climbing a crack and he's about to place a cam in there. Click. And he's placing a nut. So you can see that's the ones that aren't spring-loaded. Click. Cool. And that's my dad bouldering over a dog. No dogs were harmed in the making of this photograph. Actually, just behind the bush is his crash pad. Click.
Dog's name was Matt.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, this is just sort of showing bouldering, and some boulders can get pretty high. So the line between what is a free solo and what is a boulder problem, as we call it, it can be blurred sometimes. This one probably tops out at about 25 feet. Again, that's my friend Lily there. And she's high enough up that this guy, instead of spotting her, he's just kind of like, okay, you're on your own. Click. Anyway, that's her focused look. Continue. And she also was well known to have like a problem. She'd get chalk all over her face because, you know, we chalk up. So we have these chalk bags that we carry around and we strap onto our back. So you chalk your hands and that helps dry your hands. That was another thing that came around, you know, kind of later in climbing. So anyway, this is showing how tight we wear our shoes. At the climbing gym that I work at, everybody always, you know, I give them a pair of shoes and I say, there's your climbing shoes, and they put them on. They're like, they don't fit, they're too small. And I'm like, no, they fit, they're fine. So anyway, you can click forward on that one. Cool, so that's me climbing, that picture with the bloody hand. This is what I was climbing that day. It's a thing called bulletproof. It's an off-width crack, which is, like I said, a crack that you can't quite fit your body into too well. And so this one, the easiest way to move forward was not easy, but it was to flip upside down, jam my feet in at a high point, and then scoop my hands up, and then scoop my feet up and move up the crack upside down. Click. There we go. And then eventually you get through that part and you get to turn upright and do the rest of the crack. But that was, this was the piece of protection I was using for the upside down part there. So it's a good size cam, but you know, hanging upside down by your toes, about to slip out, and trying to stuff one of these in to just the right spot is a little bit anxiety inducing. But that's why I got the helmet on. Oh, the very helmet right there. All right, click. Cool, so this brings us to Rumney. I hope you don't mind the long intro with the other climbing areas. This is a beautiful morning up on Rattlesnake Mountain, which is what climbers just refer to as Rumney, because, you know, don't worry, we respect the rest of the town, but that's our spot. Click. And this is a little map that I made of the Rumney climbing areas. So as some of you guys drive down the street, I'm sure you look up and you see Main Cliff, or as you come back around by the private land area there, you can look up and see the hillside is littered with cliffs. But, you know, to us, we know every single little cliff. We know every single, like, nook and cranny, or at least some of us who are obsessive know every single nook and cranny. Anyway, These are all the trail systems that are in there. All these little dots are boulders, and so basically we have it all mapped out. Now, one of the things that the Rumney Climbers Association has done is protected a lot of this land. Now, originally, the Forest Service has land that sort of abuts this area here. They always had a little bit of land that came down here. But this hillside was owned by a private landowner. And so the Rumney Climbers Association, back in, I think it was 93, secured this land, not the pink part, so that all these cliffs could be protected. And that expanded the Forest Service's land down here. It was kind of a no-brainer for the Forest Service to pick up that land because they already had land abutting it. It was a beautiful hillside. Boom, let's bring that down there. So that the RCA purchased the land and sold it to the Forest Service. And then the part over on the left, the pink part, was still private land until a few years ago, and that was when I came on board with the RCA. Was to try to do some fundraising to raise money to purchase that area there. But that just kind of gives you an idea of how many cliffs are out there. There are probably 30, 35 like well-known ones, and then there's a couple other ones. So, click. Cool. Another piece of history about Rumney is the peregrine falcons nest out there. And any of you guys, I'm a big bird nut as well, so I really enjoy seeing the falcons out there. But years ago, New Hampshire had all but lost their peregrine falcons due to DDT and that whole fiasco. And there's been a program to help bring them back and restore them. And a lot of that is by closing off the land where they're nesting. And so climbers work really closely with the Audubon. I talked to our connection over there just this week to update them on where the birds are active and kind of move around the closures, because we close any cliff that peregrine falcons are nesting on, and that way they can have their space to do their thing, and then once the chicks are born, we can get back on our cliffs. But that's a shot that I took from basically the top of the mountain. You can see he's got this weird tail coming out of the top of his back there. That's a radio transceiver kind of thing. Basically, it's an antenna so that they can track his whereabouts, and they'll actually track this guy going down to South America and then coming back and things like that. So pretty cool. I think Rumney has had a real successful bunch of peregrine falcon nestings over the years, and I think last year in New Hampshire, I believe it was something like 42 or 46 chicks were fledged from the falcons in New Hampshire, and I think there were a record like 4 or 5 from Rumney, which is really cool. Cool. Click. Cool. So this is one of the cliffs up the hill. Anybody know what that one is? I know some of you do. Come on. Audience participation.
It's the summit cliff.
Hinterlands.
Oh,
So anyway, yeah, you can see the Hohe hinterland up there, right? Anyway, click. So that is the summit cliff. Actually, so we've got Yellowknife Buttress right here and Summit Cliff up there. Click one more and then we'll really recognize Summit Cliff if you know it. Boom. So this is the Summit Cliff. This is one of those cliffs that very few people visit, but it's a really cool chunk of rock. It just really drives home for me how much really nice rock climbing is up at Rumney, because this is a 200-foot section of rock that rarely sees visitors, and it's just an amazing thing to have around. Click. Boom. This is a map of Main Cliff. And basically the main cliff is the one that as you're driving in from downtown Rumney, from the white buildings there, you get about a mile down the road, you come around a corner, and right up there you see this beautiful cliff. And this is a map that my buddy Jeff made. And I wanted to show this because I don't have any pictures of people climbing the first route recorded to have been climbed at Rumney, but this shows it, and it goes right up this side of the cliff, cuts into this corner, and goes back up this way. Now we talked about finding the weakness in a cliff, right? If you're walking up, if you're like an old school climber and you've got this archaic gear, I mean, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, let's go through this part. This looks good. It's like, inverted and sketchy and whatever, and very difficult. So what you do is you follow the chimneys and the cracks and things like that. So you weave your way up here. And very few people climb that one these days, but I try to climb them all, and I did that one and found some fun in it. Click. Cool. So we basically make Rumney our home. So we go up there, take a nap, and you can chill out like that and just enjoy nature up there. Click. And you can also have a rough day of it and end up with some battle scars. But those two pictures really show the different sides of climbing, right? It can be very relaxed and it can be very aggressive and very intense. So click. Cool. So that's just a shot from up on top of the summit cliff. That's that one that I just showed you, and I was talking about how it's a 200-foot thing that nobody ever really does. I just want to check my notes here and make sure I'm catching things. Cool. So yeah, a lot of, basically that climb that was on Main Cliff, the first one, it's called Wendell's Route. It was put up by George Wendell first and George Wendell third. They were a father and son team, which, obviously is like, oh, nice. There are other fathers and sons out there doing silly things together. And other climbs got done. That was back in like early 60s. I think in the earlier part of the 60s that got done. Other people went up and poked around on the cliffs up in the 60s, but nothing was really recorded back then. It was, we find evidence of it. Honestly, I have this, which looks like it comes from about that era. And I found this out on Prudential. Yellowknife, for those of you guys who know the cliffs up there. So I found this up on Yellowknife, and I was rappelling in, hanging on the rope, looking around, and I found this thing, and I grabbed onto it, and I just pulled it out. I was like, yeah, I don't think that's going to hold. But anyway, so we find evidence of older climbs, but people weren't really reporting it. I think a lot of people looked at smaller cliffs like that as practice for those bigger climbs, like Cannon Cliff and Cathedral, Whitehorse, and stuff like that. So I don't think they really liked it as much as we did. No. All right, click. So this is up on Main Cliff in the winter. I just threw together a few. I'm coming out of a long winter of climbing up at Rumney. A lot of people that know me know that I don't really care what the weather's like. I'm going out anyway. So I think it was 5 degrees this day. And with the sun beating on you, whew, still cold.
It feels like 15.
Yeah. Click. All right. So I don't know. I just had to throw that one in. That wasn't posed. We were just out rock climbing. Click. That's actually down on Rock Rimmon down in Manchester. You can click through a few here, and I'll just let you know if I want to stop and comment. Cool. So, we saw a celebrity there. Nice. Lots of winter fun. There's this sort of sensation you get when or lack of sensation you get when it's really cold, where people who climb in the warm don't really get it. But you reach up and your hands are so numb that you feel around and you can't, if you can't see the hold, and you find somewhere it kind of sticks. You go, ooh, I think I got something. You just kind of hang on it and be like, yeah, that'll hold. And then you kind of pull out and you look and see if you're on anything. And so it's more like done sort of by bouncing on it, and then move on. And it's just a very different kind of climbing. Not everybody appreciates it. Yeah, I know that guy. All right, that's Annabelle. So if you want to know how cold it was this day, click one slide forward there. That's how cold it was that day. All right, click forward one more. Yeah, so let's just say I go through some climbing partners, right? Like I tell you, oh, it's going to be cool, it's going to be cool, you're going to have fun. And then I get that. All right. Let's see where we're at. Click. Click. That's that feisty little girl with the middle finger there. Click. Let's go through a couple more. Boom. That's a good one. We'll pause there for a second. No, apparently we won't. All right. There we go. Cool. So basically I'm going to, because this is like a group of, part climbers, part locals, basically I'm kind of, I don't want to get into a whole lot of, and it would get boring for me to go like this, like a whole lot of names and dates and things. But I'll give a general idea of how things progressed. So back in the 70s, people were mostly still doing trad climbing. So following the cracks, placing gear, the old way. Some bolts were used, but they were like definitely olds, relics, that kind of thing. And there wasn't as much documentation going on. At this point, smaller climbs were starting to get documented more regularly. And some people were, taking smaller climbs pretty seriously. But it was still, we still didn't have, guidebooks that were for every small area, and definitely not like these days. I can go out and put up a new climb, come home and put it on the internet, and all of a sudden everybody knows what I did. And also, more importantly, knows what is out there for them to do, So back in the 70s, the name that always pops up is a gentleman named Chris Hassig, and he was just the boss back in those days. He was putting up climbs that were impressing everybody. In 1981, he put up the first route. Now I'm going to talk difficulty grades. So any of you guys who don't know rock climbing, don't worry about it. It's just as the numbers get bigger, the routes get more difficult. So he put up the first 511 back in, what was that, 1981? And it was actually a 511C, so, pushed it right up there. So that was the first 511 at Rumney. It's a thing called Hassig's Libido. And he sadly passed away in 1985 in a climbing accident. There are a lot of climbers perish in alpine climbing accidents. So the type of climbing that we do up in Rumney, knock on wood, boop, is a whole lot more predictable than when you're dealing with snow and ice and common avalanches and things like that. And so, yeah, he passed away in an alpine climbing accident. And there's a plaque for him over at the Town Pound, I believe. So as climbing difficulty progressed, as we got into the 80s, I can actually drink some of that water. Anyway, the gear started to change a little bit. So instead of just using pitons and the removable nuts, people were placing bolts more often. And basically what the bolts are like, there's a few different types, but I guess back then, we'd be looking at rusty old stuff like this. But basically they're expansion bolts. So they're used in construction. So a lot of these climbers were construction workers that said, hey, we could put this in there. And that will protect our climb. So what they would do is what we call ground up bolting. Man, my stuff's just falling apart. They would do what's called ground up bolting, meaning that you would start from the bottom of the climb and you would lead the route just like I was talking about before, right? So you're on the end of the rope, you're leading up, and you'd find a good stance and you'd hand drill. So you'd take a masonry bit and a hand drill setup and you'd pound and hand drill these bolts. So you'd have to drill in far enough to get one of these expansion bolts in there, and then you'd take your tools out and you'd tighten it up, and then you'd be like, clip. All right, moving on. And then, so because it was so difficult to put the gear in, they didn't want to put too many bolts in. And on top of that, it's really hard when you're in the middle of a rock climb to find a place to stop and stand around and do this, right? So a lot of the climbs were still very dangerous, even though they were bolt protected. And so, over time, the people, as they started putting up more and more difficult routes, the tactics of how you put them up ended up sort of evolving. And in the later 80s, the first what we call rappel bolted route went in. And basically it was put up by a guy who actually had been really successful with the older style, the ground up climbing, a gentleman named Bradley White. He is still around sometimes, and he's still doing things his own way. Anyway, so he put in the first rappel bolted route at Rumney, and that means that he dropped a rope down and then rappelled in and placed his bolts while hanging on the rope, and then led up from there. And basically, that was a huge sort of ethical debate as to whether that was, reasonable tactics. Climbers tend to, we have to have something to argue about, right? So basically, some people say you have to go ground up. Some people say that's fine to rappel in. But the impressive thing, especially again for those of you guys who know the route, is the route that he put up is called bolt line, and it's a 5/8, but it's a slab route. There's not a whole lot to hold on to, and he originally put it up with 3 bolts, and so he rappel bolted, but he still didn't put much in. I'm guessing he just didn't have the money, and I'm not just saying because, like why else wouldn't you actually protect yourself? Anyway, so when you do that climb now, I believe there's 8 bolts, and it's about a 90-foot route, so it's still actually pretty exciting. And so doing it his way, there are definitely substantial risks involved. You can flip forward here, have a couple of pictures. Boom. Yeah. So that route's, anybody know that one? Who's got it? It's got that corner right up at the top. It's about 100 feet long. Northwest Territories. Buttress, yeah. All right, click. Cool. How about that one? Anybody know that one? It's an interesting angle. That one's Jolt. But High Roller was a really good guess. It has the same profile. But you can't see the river, right? The river is the key. All right, click. Cool. Click. Oh, look at that guy. Let's stop on him for a minute. I like that guy. So this route is called the Caged, and that's a pretty hard, steep sport route. And sport route means instead of having those widely spaced bolts that make the route really dangerous, we put the bolts a little closer these days, and so you actually get to climb and be safe. It's really groundbreaking stuff. So anyway, incidentally, I just realized this bolt right here is one of those bolts right there. I recently went through and replaced the old expansion bolts, these guys here, that they don't work quite as well in the soft Rumney rock as what we use now, which is a glue-in model. So this is like what we use now. It actually looks a lot like a piton, but you drill a hole and you put epoxy in it, and then you pound this in, and then the epoxy seals this in there, and these things are much stronger and they'll last much longer. So yeah, I just thought of that when I looked at that picture. I was like, look at that. That's the guy. Very cool. Cool. So basically, it's a progression as we go of difficulty and things getting more difficult, and the tactics basically getting a little looser. Basically, people started putting in more bolts, putting them in on rappel, and the cool thing about that is it opened up things to a whole lot of basically a whole lot more difficulty without danger. You know what I'm saying? So that's pretty cool. So back in the 80s, the first 512 went up, and that was called the Skewer, which is over on Main Cliff. Incidentally, that route has now been upgraded to 513, so that was a pretty stiff first 512. There's an extension on it now, but honestly, the first bit of it, the part that was originally done, deserves a little bit of credit for being a really hard 512. Also, I'm not going to call him out, but somebody in this room was on the team that put that up. Not pointing any fingers. Anyway, so that's pretty cool. So a lot of the climbers that were around back then are still climbing at Rumney, which is really cool. So I'm sorry to out him, but Tom Armstrong is one of the guys from way back in the day, and he put up the skewer and many other things. And the coolest thing is that I'm still out there. I'm climbing with these people who have been there. Like I'm, able to talk to the people who are the history of Rumney, and people who have grown with the area. And I wasn't planning on being here, but I already had it in there. So I was going to say that I really respect that Tom, for one, was one who did the old school tactics. He was putting up roots on gear. He was, using only bolts when he needed to, and pushing difficulty in that way. Took a hiatus, raised some kids from what I hear, and then came back, and all of a sudden was just like, huh, this is Rumney now. This is different. Let's get after it. And he went back in there and just started crushing roots the way that people were doing it now, and adjusting to the times, which I think is really cool. So a lot of the climbers have done that. Dan Dana, who wrote the first Rumney guidebook back in the 80s, I see him up there regularly, and some of his friends who have just kind of been like, oh yeah, this is cool, climbing's cool, however you do it. And so I really respect that, and I can't stress enough how much I respect the folks who came before in all styles of climbing in all places, and really made it such a rich history. Like I said, I'm very much into the community involved in rock climbing, and that means respecting your elders and also I don't know, just I guess that says it. So another strong guy back then was Ted Hammond. He put up all kinds of really difficult routes, again, kind of mixing the trad game with some volts, and putting up things like Flesh for Lulu. Flesh for Lulu went up with 2 bolts originally, which it's probably a 90-foot route. There was some supplemental trad gear used, but it was a very serious climb. Alan Catabraga and Scott Stevenson put up techno surfing up at Waimea, and that thing went up with minimal bolts. I forget the exact count, but it was a lot of gear and a few bolts, and some pitons that actually pulled out at one point and almost led to a ground fall from way up there. These climbs have now been what we call retro bolted, where they've been sort of updated to be safe. Those sorts of things, in climbing, there's a tradition to always ask permission from the first ascensionist in order to update a route to make it safe, or safer. And so that's something I really like about climbing, is you want to respect people and make sure that you reach out, and it's their baby. They're the one who did it originally, and you want to reach out and respect that. And a lot of these routes, the people who put them up realize, oh, that's kind of dangerous. I know, as far as on the case of techno surfing, when somebody almost took a ground fall going for a second ascent on it, the first ascensionist was like, okay, yeah, we'll put some more bolts in there. It's cool. I don't want anybody to die over this. Anyway, yeah. So also in the 80s, the first what we would call true sport climb went in. And so I was saying, sport climbs have bolts closer together, and basically some bolted routes, even now, like up in North Conway, you can have a bolted route that is not a sport route. It's serious, and if you fall, you're going to be very scared, if not hurt. And so the first actual sport route was Peer Pressure, put up by Tom Bowker. So many Toms around here. Anyway, and him and Jay Lena, I think it was, put that up, and they did do it ground up, which I thought was pretty cool. So they used hooks. I don't think I brought any hooks, but hooks are like kind of just a thing you kind of hook up around. There's what they sound like. They're a hook that you hook onto the rock and you hang on the rope, and then you can operate your gear right there. So they put that up. The name Peer Pressure came from the fact that back then things were a bit cutthroat, and when there was a new route to be had, people were trying to snake each other to get the first ascent. So they were nervous that somebody was going to come and steal the the first ascent. They didn't have enough energy left after hand drilling all the bolts to do it that day. So they came back early the next day, full of energy and probably really pumped from yesterday's work, and they ended up doing it, and a classic was born. Who's done peer pressure? Come on, raise your hands. Some of you guys have done peer pressure. It's a great route. So then,
Lee, if I could interrupt.
what's up?
With the time available, you want to cover some of the other gear too that you have?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would just say, in real brief summation, I didn't even know what we had for time, I'm sorry.
We want to get everybody out of here by 10, if we can.
Yeah, I'm almost there. Honestly, things are about to pick up quite a bit. So basically, in the 90s, things got steeper and much more difficult, and Rumney was sort of moved into the forefront of the climbing, the sport climbing world. It became a national destination. Routes in the 514 grade. Some young climbers moved in and really pushed the grades quite a bit. Could name some names, but we're going to get on to some gear. So anyway, I also wanted to just mention how the RCA came about. I kind of talked about that a little bit, but basically there was a first coming of the RCA involving some of those names that we were just talking about back in the late 80s, early 90s. Rumney had been closed to climbing due to the private land access thing, and the RCA was formed and fundraised and basically sold the land to the Forest Service. They fell out of organization for a while and then reorganized to buy that other parcel of land. You can click through some stuff while I talk here. Basically, now what we're up to is trying to preserve the land up there. That's one of the hard climbs up at Waimea. Anyway, we're trying to preserve the land up there and conserve it and make sure that we can keep it safe. So working on the soil, like deterioration and things like that. So there's a big, if anybody's interested in donating to that, the Access Fund is working on a thing called the Restore Rumney campaign. And that's going to be a very important thing. So I have gone over most of the climbing gear in general, but the things I would note, I guess, is that as I mentioned back in the old days, folks were just tying in around their waists. That was that was probably not the tactic that they ever really used at Rumney. It could have been in the very beginning, but they would tie what we call swami belts or Swiss seats. You'd make them out of webbing. You just tie your own little thing and then hook up to it, and they were not very comfortable at all. The ropes have moved forward quite a bit and have a lot more stretch to them now. So it used to be that a fall onto a climbing rope was merely survival, and these days it's it's actually pretty comfortable. You can take a 30-foot fall and just kind of be like, oh, that was fun. Anyway, so harnesses also have come a long way. Basically, you've got harnesses that have all kinds of padding built into them, and these things, again, you can sit around in them all day. You can take a big fall and not feel like you're getting your circulation cut off. The shoes are super advanced. We do things like strap rubber onto our thighs so that we can use our thighs to climb things. It's all kinds of interesting tactics. Some of the photos here reference that, but I think we've cruised through those. And then the other thing I just wanted to bring up, which I already sort of worked in, was the progression of different bolts that were used. So these days, Rumney is primarily a bolted area. You can see these quick draws are hung right there. That is basically a carabiner with a sling and another carabiner, and so those hang on the wall. And you can click through. And basically, most of the climbs at Rumney are now with bolts, and we are trying to update them all to be these guys, which are the modern, safe thing. Some of the things I've taken off recently that were pretty sketchy. This guy, I was told by one of the old locals that this was probably a hardware store bolt, just something I bought in the hardware store and threw it in there. And as he put it, this is Chris Smith, for any of you guys who know him, he said, "Yeah, that was from back when good enough was good enough." This guy I don't think was ever really good enough. It caught me a few times, but if I had known what was on there, I might not have been as comfortable on the climb. The thing about this that's crazy is this also had to go through another piece of metal before it went through the wall. And so by the time you put that piece in there, we're talking like, 3/4 of an inch in the wall. And then this one I actually just snapped off with a pry bar. It's just the end of an old 1/4 inch bolt. I went to pry on it to see if I could work it out, and it just went snap, and that took care of that. Yeah, I don't know. Basically, if you have any questions about the gear or anything like that, I could elaborate, but sorry if I went over on your time.
I'm sure you have questions from the audience. Anybody?
Keep flipping through.
How about rescues? Do you deal with any rescues?
Is that it? I personally have not done any rescues up there. Basically, I tend to climb out in the areas where there's not as many people. If I show up and it's busy at a cliff, then I will, there's your high roller. If I get to a cliff and there's a ton of people, I usually go somewhere else. So I'm usually not around when the sketchy stuff happens. But there is a mountain rescue service out in New Hampshire that will go and help out with those types of things. And climbers, if someone hears that an accident happened, everybody's on it and helping do carryouts and things like that. So.
Lee, could you talk at all about the area that the Forest Service is looking into on the way to Woodsville? What's the large slab?
Is that Oliverian? Yeah, I was thinking it might be. Yeah, I don't know. What does anybody know what?
25 headed out toward
On the way to Pike.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know exactly where they're at with that, but.
I understand they purchased the parking area.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't know whether any plans had moved forward on it.
Interesting.
No.
Oh wow, that one looks really steep. Keep going.
Not even gonna know there yet.
All right, this is over at the Buffalo Pit area. You can keep going, it's fine. That's over at the Buffalo Pit area. That's where the new parking lot has gone in for anybody who drives Buffalo Road, the farther parking lot, about a mile from the other two. And this area has seen a whole lot of development lately, and it's a great spot with routes of all difficulties. It's my friend Jalen. So that's looking out of a chimney. So basically, like there was a crack in the rock, and I'm looking out, and it's kind of a cool perspective. Go. Cool. It's a guy named Joe Kinder. He's a friend of mine that helped push climbing difficulty back in the late 90s, early 2000s. He went on to be a professional climber, and he came back for a little trip, and I took some photos of him.
I have a question.
Yep.
Who decides the difficulty number? How is that decided?
So that's actually a great question. Thank you. So that comes down to consensus. So the first person that does the climb, anybody who does what we call first ascents, will have to sort of propose a grade, and so you'll say, all right, I think this was this difficulty. And then over the years, they actually change because, say, 50 more people climb the route and they don't, not everybody agrees. So you kind of take a consensus, and it's sort of a word of mouth thing at first, and then eventually people start to agree on an average difficulty.
Where's all that recorded?
So these days, there are websites. There's a website called Mountain Project, which I'm very much involved with. And basically they catalog routes from all over the world. And we write in maps, and we put in, GPS data and things like that to, show where the climbs are. And so basically, these days it's a whole lot easier. People climb the route, they go home and they click on what they think the grade is, and then over time, it settles into to a consensus. But back in the day, it was a little different. It was more just kind of like, word of mouth, and then, oh look, the new guidebook came out, and now it's changed the grade. And basically, yeah, it's one of those community kind of things where we get together and we talk about it and kind of try to come to an agreement. Click. That's jolts. Yeah. Keep clicking through.
Is there any pushback about putting bolts in the rock and leaving them there?
That's something that has always surprised me, but not really, as long as it's done responsibly. I know, like, even out in Yosemite, these cliffs that are national treasures, like, you can put bolts in them, and the amount of yeah, pushback is very slim. Now there are regulations as far as, there are rules as far as what you can leave on the rock, but bolts are allowed at most places. Now in New Hampshire there are rules on where you can use a power drill and where you have to hand drill things. There are some spots, that developing new routes isn't acceptable, but for the most part, I think that much like creating trails for hiking, they don't really give you a hard time, even though it is technically doing damage to some natural environment. It's recreation is always sort of well respected, especially in places like New Hampshire, where the recreation there's a lot of money and things like that in it. So, what's up?
Although there's obviously a lot of strength involved, I'm more impressed by how limber everybody seems to be.
Absolutely, yeah. With her getting her foot right up next to her, right next to her hand.
A lot of time, especially if you're not climbing every day like you tend to. For those